Good afternoon to you, good people. You are welcome to today's town hall meeting discussion themed Ending Lockdown Tyranny, Lessons, Choices, Reflections Beyond COVID-19 Mandates. My name is Evelyn Naikova and I am your host for this discussion. I am joined by a panel of 6. I'll introduce all of them. We have Honorable Alice Alaso that will be joining us shortly. We have Dr. Mark Changizi. He is a scientist. We have Megan Mansell. She is an educationist. We have Dr. Eva Mugisa. She is a pharmacist. We have Nyanjura Doreen, a politician, a Ugandan politician. And finally, we have Simon Senyonga, a lawyer. I thank all our panelists for taking the time to join in for today's discussion. This discussion is really intended for us to introspect and critically examine our performance, both nationally and internationally, regarding the COVID-19 response. We hope to draw some inspiration, positive experiences, results across the board that we can employ going forward in order to kind of shoot the trajectory of our nation forward. My first panelist interaction will be with Megan Mansell. Megan Mansell is a former district education director of a special populations integration, serving students who are profoundly disabled, immunocompromised, undocumented, autistic, and behaviorally challenged. Megan, you're very welcome. We're going to start off by discussing mask mandates. I've observed that over the past couple of months, opposition to mask mandates, particularly or especially for children, has grown. There are various schools of thought that argue that masks are not as relevant as the scientists have painted it to be, or the media has kind of projected it to be. I'll just ask to find out from you, what is your experience with this whole mask mandate situation in Florida?
Well, I'd like to start with regulations, and anything that you see in the workplace that someone's required to wear as a personal protective standard. It's highly regulated, it's highly tested. Apparatuses that need a fit test in order to have to wear them. You have to undergo medical clearance and medical consent as part of the process. And the apparatus has to be deemed mitigating. It has to be deemed effective for whatever the particle grade is that you're trying to keep yourself from inhaling, for instance. If you're trying to block a given particle, then the apparatus you use has to be, regulated and tested to be able to meet that standard. But we've thrown all of those standards out the window, and someone convinced everybody that all of these apparatuses were both safe for long-term wear and interchangeable, when in workplace respirator use, you would end up with a far higher grade respirator with an airline for the amount of time that people are wearing them. But child masks in and of themselves are unregulated, untested apparatuses with no efficacy standards for the particle size range of hand. So you can't say that they're safe, you can't say that they're effective. And furthermore, what I've gone is I've taken a replica design of what children are faced with on a day-to-day basis, and I've encouraged doctors to go before IRBs, or it's a kind of ethics review board, and I've encouraged them to take, okay, here is what it looks like, what you're asking of children day in and day out. Here's what you're asking people day in and day out. I want you to go and break it down by what the base facts of this are, that they're going to be punished for non-compliance with an unfitted, untested apparatus with no efficacy standards. There will be no medical clearance or medical consent as part of the process. And if a child or employee is suffering from decreased oxygen, they have to keep wearing it or face punishment like running laps or missing out on preferred activities for non-compliance, all while it's not a mitigating issue. And not only is it not a mitigating issue, but it can make things far worse. Everyone was very much convinced from the start that this was a droplet-based pathogen, and droplets behave differently than aerosols. Aerosols remain aloft for hours in enclosed spaces and have an 18 to 20 foot trajectory. So if this guy's sitting right next to me, I'm having his exhale plumes blown directly in my face, which is a terrible idea when you're trying to keep yourself from getting something that your neighbor has. And so looking at exhale plumes caused by different masks is an important component of this, as is understanding the severe detrimental effects, the severe detrimental physiological effects experienced by extended masking. Deoxygenation, hypercapnia, fiber inhalation, into the deep lung where your body is not able to expel these fibers, in addition to masks themselves being in this warm, moist, porous environment right in front of your mouth and nose. So when you're picking up microbes from your environment, if you're in a restroom and picking up flush plumes, it's gross to talk about, but that's all getting caught in this medium in an area that's primed for biological amplification. And so, it's important to be detailed there in that.
Thank you, Megan. You spoke about regulations and what really should influence it. I just want to bring into question a recent development in the US regarding vaccination for children, especially because you do have special interest in children. As you might be aware, CDC recently approved the Pfizer vaccine for children aged between 5 and 11. I think Moderna already has one for children aged between 12 and 17, and I think Johnson & Johnson for 18 and older. Now, already you have, according to the statistics that I've come across, already close to 1 million children, over 900,000 children have already been vaccinated out of 28 million children. Pfizer asserts that the latest clinical trials show that the results are promising for children, and this is an attempt to get back children into living normal lives, playing with their friends and going to school and going to all these restaurants and things like that. So with the whole vaccine development, especially for the children age bracket, what is your comment on that? What is your take on this development?
I don't push medicinals without longitudinals on reproductive age and younger groupings, period. You don't have longitudinal safety standards. This is an emergency use authorization for a group that has a near zero infection fatality rate. And I think that it's really important when you're pushing something to look at the risk-benefit analysis of whether or not what they're taking is by any means necessary. Children have a very low risk of severe onset of this, and for children who do have profound immune issues, many of them are unable to take a vaccine because vaccines can elicit an undesirable immune response. And so what I think is really important is it's there, but by no means should be pushed on younger groupings. If you're an elderly individual and this isn't going to have an impact on anybody but you and for generations to come, there will be no impact. I don't see the same great harm as pushing this en masse on younger groupings when we just don't have any longitudinal safety data, and we've been down this road with other medicinals before that have ended up being pulled from the market for severely unsafe consequences. And we're seeing a lot of that already. You're getting health warnings locally of the signs of myocarditis. When in the history of the world was that something that you ever saw billboards up for children? And that's because it's it's not a common diagnosis for children until now. And I just think that this is an area in particular that we need to be incredibly cautious.
Right. You mentioned that some children might have immune issues and therefore not able to take the vaccine. So as somebody that has operated within school administration systems and understands the gravity of kind of pushing down something that might have an adverse effect on children over an extended period of time, how would you suggest that a safe environment is created for all? Because obviously we have a section of parents that believe their children should get immunized, and quite a number of them have already taken their children for immunization. We probably have another section of parents that believe otherwise for various reasons. So how can we create a safe environment that kind of caters for all children, despite their varied beliefs, different medical issues? How do we create, in your opinion, a safe environment that kind of harbors such children?
I have an article out, and I'll pop the link to it over here. But the article I have is how to do tiered integration systems for severely and profoundly disabled to normal populations. The article is called Goldilocks and the 4 Tiers of Student Integration. And it's how every single person, no matter what their personal feeling is on whether or not you should have these need for additional measures of protection, how to go about accommodating all voices as equals and in a way that doesn't interfere with others. And I think it's important to note that there are profoundly disabled individuals, there are severely immunocompromised individuals out there who are in legitimate need for additional measures of protection. But playing make-believe isn't how we best help them. Best practice for helping them would be identifying that there is a significant need and reducing their level of commingling with the general population in kind of uncharted groupings. If you're a severely and profoundly disabled individual in the immune response realm and you consider yourself extremely susceptible to this or other respiratory airborne pathogens, then you shouldn't be just living life as normal, but you also shouldn't be playing make-believe. And because playing make-believe with an unregulated, untested apparatus also has severe physiological impacts that can increase your susceptibility to the onset of disease, at the same time that it increases a false sense of security among people that they're protected, they get closer, they stay in a given environment longer, when the things that really impact an airborne pathogen are things like airflow, and the mitigating standards for that are things like dilution and destruction technologies such as HVAC improvements or UVC or needlepoint sanitization for your HVAC systems or given environment that you're in. And these things have a real meaningful impact, as does behavior, encouraging people to take the time they need when ill and staying home is a good practice. But in our schools, even here, we've seen where quarantine policies have the ill student stay home while their siblings still go to school every day. Now the kid they sat next to in class has to stay home in quarantine for 8 to 14 days, depending on the school that they're in. However, the sibling who lives at home when that's the most likely place that you're going to transmit or receive a given pathogen is in your home setting. And so we're not being logical, we're not being exact enough with people. And it's like everybody just wanted to kind of pretend that doing something was better than doing nothing, when doing something in this circumstance can exacerbate the issue because you're making a particle behave differently than it otherwise would have. end. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, because this is, at its very core, about particle behavior. It's not some big bad virus, and it's not a big, it is, but it isn't a medical issue until you get sick. What it is before any of that is just a particle wafting in the ether, and it needs to be treated as such, because that is how you go about functionally mitigating something, instead of just saying, oh, well, I hope this works, and I hope that if enough people get on board with this, then it's going to work for everybody. But this is a low enough minimum infective dose pathogen where one exhale can have enough viral load to infect multiple people. And so it's kind of helpful to imagine someone smoking in an elevator, because your output, your respiratory output, has it where you put out 100,000 virions a minute. You breathe 16 to 20 times a minute. So each exhale has an atmospheric viral load contribution of 5,000 virions, where the understood minimum infective dose of this pathogen is 1,000 virions. So that's one exhale, that's 5 or more people, at the most conservative estimate, that could be potentially exposed to this given hazard. And so when you're not specific enough, if you're only reducing 3% of that, well, okay, you've still put out enough to infect other people. So that is not effective mitigation. And in the standards for PPE here, and in the standards for PPE usage, masks and respirators are created to protect the wearer from their environment. A surgical mask is for large droplet splatter and spray in surgical settings. It's not to protect the patient from the doctor. It's the other way around. In a dental practice, also, when saliva and biological matter ends up on the dentist's mouth or dentist mask, they don't wear that all day, and it's porous by design so that they can breathe while they're undergoing these treatments. But if somebody is in a direct exposure scenario, they're not wearing a surgical mask, they're wearing high-grade respirators. And if they're wearing a high-grade respirator for an extended period of time, they have to wear something that has a supplemental airline to account for oxygen loss and CO2 concentrations. And so it's important for people to know these are not all interchangeable. They don't all do the same thing. And whomever said, well, we just need to sew something up, I understand that there were supply chain shortages and that people were trying to do the best they could, but what it did was it took focus away from what actually mitigates this given exposure element, and just pretending isn't going to make it go away.
All right, thank you. Very interesting discussion you have there, Megan. You mentioned that instead, one of the things that we ought to be looking at are mitigation strategies, as opposed to insisting that vaccines must be mandated. I just want to bring in Dr. Eva at this point. Dr. Eva is a pharmacist. I mentioned that she's a pharmacist. She's registered and has been practicing for over 11 years and has been one of the frontliners in the management of COVID-19 at community level. Eva, I want to bring you in regarding vaccine mandates. Unfortunately, currently in Uganda, we have vaccines, with the vaccine rollout strategy, we have vaccines being mandated for teachers, government facilities, security personnel, and medics as well. I think over the past week, we've seen, news springing up where students are denied entry into higher learning institutions. Just recently, we had the parliament go up, because of, mandated vaccination for them. My question to you is, are there clinical exemptions to vaccines?
Thank you so much for that question. It's a door to so many things, because in Uganda, we do have what we call an Immunization Act. It was last appended in 2017, I believe. And in it, there's about 3 clauses that mention that immunization or vaccination in minors, that's 18 years and below, there can be exemptions based on medical grounds. So there's 3 times this is mentioned where there are what we call immunization schedules, and those have been for what we normally call the killer diseases, the polio, tetanus, and so many others, hepatitis and influenza have been included there as well. So there have been existing immunization schedules for some of these diseases, which are children are more susceptible to than adults. And there's also been immunization documents, immunization cards that are issued to children of school-going age. Okay, so under the Immunization Act, there's a part that talks about compulsory immunization, or in this case, it would be compulsory vaccinations. And there is a clause it's actually clause number 3 in part 2 and clause number 3 in a few latter parts, where it says that if there are medical grounds for which a child is not eligible to be inoculated with a specific vaccine, then the medical practitioner has a responsibility and has the permission. Now, this is a statutory instrument, the Immunization Act. So it's not a suggestion, but it's actually legally and governmentally acknowledged to be weighty enough to request for an exemption for mandatory vaccination. So how would a parent or somebody go about this? Well, first of all, when I look at the chemistry, what we know about the new COVID-19 vaccines, there's a number of excipients, those are additives besides the active ingredients that have been known to cause, for example, acute, severe, let me say allergic reactions, what we call anaphylactic reactions like polyethylene glycol. And then there's also other substances that are added into that lipid nanoparticle, the shell that delivers the mRNA in the case of the mRNA vaccines. In adults, we have actually, as in the scientific community, we are aware that there is interaction of some of these excipients besides even the active, the mRNA itself, that has elicited responses that are undesirable, and we've categorized that under adverse adverse events post-vaccination. So in children, I would say that they're actually even more sensitive because of their development. Their cell division relative to that of adults it's ongoing. Their bone marrow and their long bones are not capped yet. That process will go on until 16 or 18. So they're a very, very delicate cohort for which even within that, there's a number of children who have allergic histories, hypersensitivities, maybe a positive family history, for example, of high raised levels of immunoglobulin E and A, which are associated with asthma. And maybe there's families that have autoimmune conditions. There's a high propensity for those. And because of that, for example, if you have a child who's being nebulized for asthma every rain season, we live in the tropics here. So every time there's a really, really bad spell of rain, there's children who can't make it to school, but they're in the clinic for nebulization almost every morning. So because of that, they do have a medical history that can serve as grounds to seek an exemption from their medical practitioner. In this case, the medical practitioner would have to be someone who is licensed, somebody who's licensed under the governing body, but also registered under the professional body where they serve. And they would also have to be employed in a health facility that is also licensed and that operates within the guidelines, the minimum requirements for a health facility. And one of those is that they must have what we call a Form 5. It is a basic prescription that is headed with the name of the facility, with its address, And for the case of medical exemptions, or maybe a letter, let's say, to the infirmary, to the sick bay, that this child cannot come into school, or maybe they cannot be involved in strenuous physical education activities and sports, they would have to give a brief about their medical condition and then have it stamped. And this medical practitioner also ideally should be contractually recognized by the institution, that the hospital or clinic where they work, so that in case there is anything that comes, by way of government inquiries about a mandated vaccination, but this child has been given an exemption, or they have a document from a medical practitioner requesting for them to be exempted for it, they can they have the backup of the institution of the hospital or children's clinic or health center where they work, but they also are cognizant of of what is permissible by the law, which actually we can see in the Immunization Act. So within Uganda, we do have provision for that, and it would be good for our listeners and our viewers to know that, and also for the medical fraternity to have the confidence that there is there's a statutory instrument that gives them that kind of that gives them room to make medical exemptions for children whose history is the medical grounds for which they are not eligible for the vaccine.
All right, thank you, Dr. Eva. Right about now, I will get back to you, Eva, at some point, but I'm going to invite Dr. Mark Changizi. Very interesting name you have there, Mark. Maybe just briefly about Mark. He is an American theoretical cognitive scientist. He is known for his research on evolutionary origins of biological and cognitive design. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Changizi became a vocal critic on social media pandemic-related measures and policies, arguing that they infringe on free expression. In 2020, together with his colleague Dr. Tim Barber, Changizi started FRIX, a study group for developing his ideas. Dr. Changizi, I'm going to bring you in still as we discuss mask mandates. Mansell seems to have given us the scientific perspective on why there's been a bit of opposition to mask mandates. What I find interesting from one of your videos that I came across is that you link mask mandates to limiting freedom of expression and being a precursor for censorship. Please share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it relates to free expression and censorship in sort of obvious ways. But my next book is about the origins of emotional expressions, and most of us have this intuition that the important stuff that we say are the words and the sentences, and that we have the intonation and prosody and all of the kinds of emotional stuff is sort of fluff on top that's a little bit important but not that important. So free speech is really mostly about the speech and maybe a little bit about the emotional expressions, but really that gets it backwards. Most of the origins, the history of humanity, it's relatively recent, in the last hundreds of thousands of years that we spoke at all. The language of social animals generally, and the language of us, our true language, is our emotional expressions. The worst thing that you can do as a speaker or as an actor, I mean, if an actor can't express the emotions, then the story is going to be awful. If you have a bunch of people just canned and they're talking in a very serious voice, but they're following the same story as West Side Story, but in absolute straight robot voice, it's going to be the worst movie you've ever seen. Whereas pure expression can be great to watch. A lot of art and music is about pure expression. Music, in fact, I've argued in one of my earlier works, is really the sounds of a human. It's culturally evolved. It sounds like humans moving evocatively around us. There's no propositional content. There's no sentences in it, but we're willing to listen all day because it's emotional content, and that's often what conveys the true message. And in discussions with people, it really is emotional expressions that are interacting with each other and deciding the matter as to how the negotiation or the compromise will be settled between the two people. These things are happening constantly, but we're not aware of them because we've evolved to do them. The stuff that we've evolved to do, we're not explicitly aware of because our brain is incredibly good at it. We're really consciously aware of when we're playing chess because we are terrible at chess, because this is something we're not designed to do. So people often get it backwards. They think the really smart stuff that the humans do are the stuff that these sort of really high IQ, nerdy chess types do. No, that's exactly the stuff that we didn't evolve to do. The stuff that we evolved to do, it doesn't feel like anything to do it. And when you cover up your face, you're shielding 90% of these emotional expressions. You get a little bit from the eyes, you get intonation of the voice if you can still hear the voice, of course, that's her. But the emotional expressions are primarily in the voice, and of course also in the gestures and even in the colors of each color changing of the skin. But you're really killing the main channel, which is the face, when you cover over the emotional expressions.
All right, interesting. Speaking of evolution, there's a school of thought that the whole COVID-19 management has evolved from being a public health crisis to a political debate between freedom and control, freedom versus control. I think it was just last week, Biden's vaccine mandate was stayed by the Fifth Circuit until any further order, arguing that it's not just about the whole vaccine mandate, is not about whether the vaccine is a good or bad thing, but whether Americans would be ceding their freedom to make choices, so much so that the government has got to mandate whether or not they should take the vaccine without their opinion on it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I did an earlier video nearly a year ago on how this debate in some countries, because of the way things are polarized, sometimes in some new topic that isn't left or right, nevertheless, the previous polarizations of society, the political polarizations, could end up just creating a shift so that the left, for no particular reason, becomes pro-COVID hysteria and like COVID is the most dangerous thing ever, whereas on the other side becomes the opposite. And it need not be that there's a left-right issue at all. And it didn't, there are certainly loads of people on the left that are on my side of this argument, and loads of people on the right that are just as authoritarian about it. But there was certainly a strong correlation in the United States, and there's some anti-correlations. It shifted the other way in different countries around the world. But really, the real argument, you shouldn't let yourself be confused if you're sitting in a country where the left went to the more authoritarian viewpoint, the authoritarian viewpoint in these sort of standard diagrams that we draw. Don't let yourself think that this is a left-right thing. It happens to correlate somewhat with the old left, the old right people, but it's not about left and right. It's about freedom versus authoritarianism, and so try to blow away your old associations. And so, because sometimes now your new friends might be people that were completely opposed to you before on the typical left-right arguments. Now, I want, in terms of mandates, I wanted to back up as a scientist and mention this when Megan was mentioning this. I have previous work on just, perceptual illusions, why we see illusions and things like this. And if you're a scientist like me, and I want to just show you on a computer screen or just printouts of an illusion, like the typical illusions where there's a whole bunch of just radiating lines and two lines and you perceive it to be bowed, things like this, right? Nothing bad is going to happen to you, right, when you look at a picture of just a few stray lines, right? But nevertheless, we have to go to an internal review board, an ethics review board, that we have to make the entire case that here's all the things that could happen or not happen, and they've got to prove it that it's ethically okay. And then we've got to present to the subject, say, look, here's some crazy things that in principle, just because we're trying to be creative, could happen to you, really bad things. Maybe you get epilepsy by looking, whatever. You have to show them, here's all these amazingly crazy things that probably aren't going to happen, but maybe it could happen. Do you still consent, right? But in the world today, we have instead, consent wasn't required, internal review board, ethical reviews weren't required, evidence wasn't required to get the entire populations to be required to stay at home, the businesses to be forcibly shut down, everybody on earth pretty much required to wear a mask, many having to do so all day long, whether you're an adult or a child. So the notion of informed consent, which has been very well understood for quite a long time, such that even for ridiculously simple, non-harmful, obviously not harmful, stray lines on a piece of paper, suddenly was all thrown away, and putting something on someone's face and covering their only two breathing holes and their emotional expressions and their lower visual field all day long, suddenly not only couldn't possibly have any harm, and it's ridiculous to even suppose that it does, and shows you're a conspiracy theorist, but it should be required and forced upon people, and if they don't or they argue against it, they're enemies of the people. So you have to imagine yourself what's really going on. And the gorilla, and I'm invited to a lot of these things, and people argue about the epidemiology, they argue about masks, they argue about lockdowns, and the big gorilla in the room, and is that none of this is about any of that, right? What's going on is a kind of mass hysteria. And if you've ever had, and I've had friends or relatives that were in a cult, if you've ever known somebody in a cult, and they're often very intelligent people, there's nothing wrong with their minds. When they're in a cult and they get into this deep state, you can argue in circles for hours and hours and days and weeks, and they just run you in circles about all the different reasons, because they have all these crazy ideas, but they're part of this community that is backing it up, and they've created these narratives within that community. You can't crack them. And you come from 4,000 different angles. If you've ever done, you can't crack them. This is why we feel like we're just talking our ears off, and we slay one dragon, and then the other head of there's 1,000 heads to this many-headed dragon, and you're talking about, okay, we've shown that mask mandates didn't do anything. The masks didn't do anything because of all of the different kinds of controls, or they can't. And there's another one that pops up. What about this? Each week we're taking on a new thing, because none of this is really about that. What's going on is a psychosocietal phenomenon that's happened worldwide this time, whereas usually it would have happened in this country or that country, which then got wrecked because of these kinds of totalitarian forces. But this time it happened everywhere, pretty much all at once. And back to, and this is the kinds of things that I study. I study emergent phenomena. I study psychology and cognitive issues, and how culture itself evolves to shape itself for us, and how when things go wrong in these kinds of social networks, you can get groupthink and get further down the line of totalitarian things. I'm the kind of guy that studies exactly those sorts of things, and so my FreeX, freex.group is the website. We're started this new research institute that's devoted to understanding these kinds of psychosocietal forces, which are the kinds of things that are shaping all of what's going around us for the last 20 months. And I try to talk about, we want to understand it. We want to understand it so that we can understand what happened to us, even if we can't stop it. We want to understand, are there ways potentially of stopping? What are the best ways of trying to stop it? Are there ways of inhibiting it in the future so that the social networks don't create these kinds of positive feedback loops, which have to do with fear and fear of infection and things like this, so that it doesn't happen again? But one of the simplest ways to stop this kind of thing goes back to informed consent and civil rights. If every state and every citizen in their bones believed and understood that no one's allowed to just force a mask on somebody else at all. You're just not allowed to do it. Or if you are, there has to be all these loops of informed consent and lots of great evidence of no harms, lots of great evidence of efficacy, and so forth. If only societies that have a deep respect for civil liberties and civil rights, if they don't have that, then when these kinds of things sweep through, and they're always going to sweep through humans, because humans are always going to be humans. We're never going to change in this way. Without those kinds of breaks at each individual level saying, no, we're not allowed to do that, then they're going to just sweep through. So that's one of the biggest problems that I think that we have, is ultimately a lack of understanding of the value of civil liberties, which includes both, of course, free expression, as well as just the ability to control others willy-nilly with emergency authorization. And so that these are the kinds of things that I focus on, are these cognitive psychosocietal issues and their interaction with sort of politics and civil liberties.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. I'm just going to turn my table to a politician in the House, one of our Ugandan politicians. That's Doreen Nyanjura. Doreen, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, we're happy to have you. Thank you for joining in and giving us your time.
Thank you.
Please, Doreen, for those of you that might not know her, she's a Ugandan politician, obviously, and the Deputy Lord Mayor of KCCA, that's Kampala Capital City Authority. She's also the KCCA female councillor representing Makerere University. in KCCA. Doreen, let's talk about the political management of COVID-19. Just last week, news making rounds indicated that a select committee had been formed or instituted to inquire into the mismanagement or misappropriation of COVID-19 funds, and charges are being brought against Dr. Monica Musenero. We've also had quite a bit of controversy surrounding the stimulus packages that were supposed to have been rolled out to varied persons within our country following the outbreak of the COVID-19. What has been your experience with this?
Thank you so much. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of this event and conversation. These engagements are very crucial in promoting dialogue on matters concerning the pandemic and how we deal with it. Now, to go straight to the discussion and the plan of ending the lockdown tyranny, I want to be honest that even before we got Corona, even before the Corona tyrannic times as a country, Uganda has really suffered a lot. Uganda has gone through a lot. The pandemic was mismanaged, and it encouraged more exclusion, definitely. The pandemic here in Uganda became an opportunity for some people to earn and gain, while the majority of the lives of Ugandans got shattered and destroyed. Then what happened? Then we saw politicians rushing to parliament and asking for supplementary budgets and grants to manage the pandemic in courts. Now, like some of you might be knowing, this pandemic is definitely a healthy issue. Now, health in Uganda, or COVID-19 in Uganda, was never given a priority, but rather the military became a priority. This is why even during the Corona times, during lockdown, the budget to the Ministry of Defense and Internal Affairs in the lockdown was more than what was allocated to the health. Actually, in some supplementary budgets, State House got more money than health. So whereas people were suffering, this became another bonanza. That is why cabinet of around 80 people remained sitting every week. Parliament of around 550 people remained sitting. Yet local councils, which are closer to the people, were suspended and could not decide on behalf of their people. This includes Kampala Capital City Authority, where I am a leader. We were never consulted and didn't participate in any of the processes to save our people during lockdown. So I am not surprised that, like you clearly stated last week, there was this whole debate about money being mismanaged. That is exactly what has been happening since we're hit by Corona. Now, terminating services of local council leaders meant that RDCs, residents, district commissioners, became chairpersons of the task force of COVID-19. Now, these RDCs that we have in different districts are also chairpersons of security in different districts. So this simply implied that in Uganda, when it came to the pandemic, when it came to Corona, the military simply took over. Now, that it was that tyranny that saw most of our people being beaten. I don't know, for those who are following events in Uganda, many people were beaten during that time because they got tired of staying home. They had nothing to eat. The lame were even made more lame because of the beatings. And of course, there are many people that lost their lives because they couldn't keep home. Now, exclusion did not only happen at the political level, it also went to our education system. For example, we might be aware, or we are aware, that children of the political elites here in Uganda do not study from Uganda, but study from abroad. And much as the whole world has opened their schools, in Uganda, the schools are still locked. By the way, even in the first lockdown, international schools remained open. So we had children who were getting education while others were not getting education. The children from well-to-do families were studying because most of them are international schools. So what does this point out? It points out one fact, that children were denied education, and yet their mothers who are trying to look for some money to feed them were being beaten. There was some relief that was given out, but we know it was mismanaged. We know that the local leaders were never involved in this system, and the money for relief never reached the intended benefit. Of course, all that I have talked about creates very bad effects in our population. There's been an increase in gender-based violence, abuse of drugs, teenage pregnancies have also increased. Now, the effect of this lockdown has definitely had a permanent damage on our society that might be beyond repair, and therefore we must use this history and background to prepare for what might come in future. For example, we can talk of giving grants to government, to private schools, because they're offering a service which government schools alone cannot manage to provide to over 15 million children in school. You can think about mechanisms on how to manage the school fees problem. For example, a parent who is getting money from a bar or a school has not earned for the last 2 years. So if we open schools and we tell children to go to school, parents will not manage, and that cycle will continue. Nairobi is open. It has vaccinated more people than Uganda. Kenya has over 2 million people fully vaccinated. It has 2 million people that have been vaccinated, and they clearly give us the statistics. It has 2 million people fully vaccinated, but it also has 5.9 million people that at least have got their half dose. Yet in Uganda, we only see Ministry of Health telling us about doses administered, which are equal to 4.8 million. They don't tell us whether these are people that are fully vaccinated or they just got one dose. Now, that means we really have to look at our communication. I know there are people who are probably excited about the end of the lockdown. I'm not among those looking towards the end of lockdown, because there is no planning on how this lockdown is going to end. We seem to be, there's no planning whatsoever that has gone on. If there's anything that personally I have learned from this lockdown and COVID-19, for me, I've learned that in Uganda, we have a government that does not care about its people. And as a leader, of course, I'll continue to rally Ugandans. As a leader, I'll continue to root so that we make sure there is fairness and equity, because this is a foundation, and I believe that is how we can be able to manage this pandemic. Now, at KCCA, of course, many of you might be wondering, because I'm talking about KCCA, I am part of government. KCCA is subordinate to the government of Uganda. And when government of Uganda is doing well, even us as KCCA, we are doing well. If government is failing, then even us at KCCA, we are failing. What we are doing at KCCA is just a drop in the ocean. We can always continue to advise government, but it's up to them to take what we tell them. At KCCA, we can always continue to give them the policy alternatives like we have always done. But the lesson is I have picked that in Uganda, the ordinary people are not treated as a priority. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Doreen. Just to take you on regarding full reopening of the economy, you mentioned that you're not particularly excited about the full reopening of the economy because there doesn't seem to have to be a comprehensive plan on how that is going to be effected. Now, we seem to have statistics. We do actually have statistics, following the whole COVID-19 pandemic situation and the lockdowns that were implemented. On one hand, were countries that implemented quite stringent lockdowns, very harsh lockdowns. Some countries still are experiencing that. And then we have, on the other hand, countries that never locked up. We cannot override or neglect the glaring evidence from countries like Tanzania and Sweden that never locked up. Currently, Sweden is ranked 53rd on the global scorecard of deaths resulting from COVID-19, despite the fact that it never locked down. We also have countries that initially locked down, but over time have taken on a school of thought that maybe lockdowns are not as effective over an extended period of time. Now, as Uganda and as really Kampala, or just Uganda as a whole, what lessons can we draw from that experience?
Well, thank you so much. I think personally, what I have picked from that is that COVID-19 is still around, and therefore we are not going to lock down the country forever. So what exactly are we supposed to do? I think it's up to us to rally citizens so that they get vaccinated. Now, the unfortunate bit about Uganda, we have currently not purchased any vaccines for the population. We are merely relying on donations. So the most important thing is to make sure we have the vaccines, and then we rally citizens so that they are vaccinated. We make sure we train citizens on how to boost their immunity. Because if I look at the countries that were never sent into a lockdown, there's almost no difference with Uganda. All I am seeing is that in Uganda, the economy has gone down. All I am seeing is that in Uganda, people are getting poorer and poorer. So let's mobilize people to vaccinate, and then we open up the country. At the end of the day, we have a government that is not even thinking about giving relief to those whose schools have been locked for the past 2 years. We are talking about a government that is not willing to help the ordinary Ugandans. So for me, that's what I pick from there. We don't really need a lockdown in order for us to fight COVID-19.
All right. My last question to you is that you mentioned that when you observe countries that went into a lockdown and those that really never went into any lockdown, there's really no difference in the statistics, so to say. Now, I think we have to admit that even in the absence of vaccines, it seems that there's still no difference, and maybe our insistence should not really be on majorly rallying up citizens to get vaccinated. For those that want, by all means, that is a decision that they can take. But at the end of the day, it should not be tied to the full reopening of the economy, because truth be told, even in the absence of those vaccines, those economies remained open. And now, particularly, specifically, I will speak about nations where even places of worship remained open. As you might know, there's an illusion that places of worship are reopened in Uganda, but to give a limit of 200 people is as good as telling people stay home. What is your advice concerning that, especially because now, just from your submission, if I understood you correctly, I think it's high time that the economy opened, but specifically for places of worship, which seem to have been given very little regard. What is your take on their full reopening?
I really totally agree with you, because for me, it doesn't make sense at all for places of worship to remain closed, for schools to remain locked, and yet we have very crowded places in markets. We have Chikugo or Wino. Those in Uganda, those places that are still operating. The children that are being denied an opportunity to go to education, the children that are being denied an opportunity to go to places of worship are the same children at the end of the day that are going in this market. So from the word go, for me, that kind of arrangement did not make any sense to me. And I've over time stated. So it didn't make sense to me for schools to remain closed. It didn't make sense to me for places of worship to remain closed. And yet we know very well that Uganda is a God-fearing nation, that when our people are traumatized, they always run to places of worship. And I equally agree with you that vaccination should not be on gunpoint. People should be given a choice to go and vaccinate. Unfortunately, even for those that want to go and get vaccinated, they have not been able to vaccinate. They have not been able to vaccinate.
All right, thank you very much, Doreen. Now I'm going to bring in Dr. Eva. One of the things that Dr. Mark Changizi mentioned while giving his submission on the topic at hand is informed consent. Now, there was a correspondence that made rounds in the last week of October, where one of the things that is to be implemented was that consent forms were to be removed and before vaccination. My question to you as a medic and as one that follows ethics, what is the implication of not having consent forms? Because my understanding, at least, is that once I'm presented with a consent form, I am explained to, and I have perfect and full understanding of the decision that I am taking. So in the absence of that, what does that mean for us?
Thank you for that question. The issue of consent is a very sensitive and broad topic, but if we could just trim it down into a few points. First of all, just like you have said, consent forms are an instrument that is used as a bilateral agreement between the therapeutic or the health care provider and the recipient of the health care to agree to the T's and C's or the pros and cons of the procedure or therapeutic that they're going to receive. Consent forms are something that gives legal backup should there be a casualty on the side of the recipient of the healthcare procedure or therapeutic agent. And consent forms have been used for procedures as really many of them, from cesarean section to a surgery that is considered major, to consent for a procedure for a minor, which usually is done in the presence of a parent, and the parent consents on behalf of their child. And it's also been used for persons who are not minors, but who do not have the mental capacity to make a decision, for an informed decision for themselves. Perhaps if they have a mental handicap or maybe a learning disability, like let's say cerebral palsy, where cognitive function has been affected. So it's something that in medical practice that I have seen and known that is part of the day-to-day healthcare routine. And I do know that at the beginning of the rollout of the vaccinations, the COVID-19 vaccinations in Uganda, the Minister of Health and the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Health within Uganda, Dr. Rutha Cheng and Dr. Diana Twina, respectively, mentioned that because this vaccine has been released and we were graciously given doses under what they call EUA, which is Emergency Usage Authorization, and not much was known about these vaccines because of the technology, which is new, then there would be a consent form that was given to everybody who would show up to receive the jab. And in that consent form, they'd be captured the biodata of the vaccinee, the intending person to get the jab. And that information was kept. They were given information about the benefits and the risks of the jab, of the vaccine that they were going to receive. And also there was a post-vaccination monitoring exercise that was done. First, I think the people who had received the vaccine, the first batch that we received, were kept in the facility, in the healthcare center or the hospital at the vaccination site for monitoring for at least 2 hours to see if there was anything like maybe what we call acute anaphylactic shock, which is like an allergic reaction that happens within 30 minutes or so after administration of the jab. So they'd be monitored, and after that, I do recall actually the Minister of Health emphasizing that there would be a follow-up exercise, a monitoring exercise. She did not state the length of time for which this would happen, but all of the information and all the findings, were there any adverse events that emerged post-vaccination in the recipients? All that information was to be captured in different recording systems, but the consent form was a vital part of that system of recording and information. So the consent form served two ways: to give protection to the healthcare provider, that in case there was any side effect, they would be protected from lawsuits, etc. And also it would state that the recipient of the vaccine and fully understood, had been explained, had been given all the information pertinent to that important decision whether to accept the vaccine or not. And if they agreed, they appended their signature to them. So that was started off with the consent forms, and at least we had some confidence that people were getting the education that they needed about the pros and cons of the vaccine. Now, with the memo from the Ministry of Health that had been making rounds of recent about the consent forms being withdrawn, and and people now, they said that they had enough doses available, so consent forms are not part of this anymore. I feel that there's a really big ethical gap, a really big ethical issue that comes in, because now we have the question of, does the recipient of the vaccine, are they getting all the information that is required? I personally have not looked at the consent form, but I do have clinician colleagues who have. And of the 20 or so side effects, possible adverse effects. Now, when we looked at the consent forms before they were withdrawn, much of that information was not there. So my colleagues, that is, who looked at it, and when this information was relayed, we realized that there was something that wasn't very clear about how informed the education process was concerning the vaccine. So with complete withdrawal, we wonder why it was withdrawn. However, it is not ethical to withdraw information that is pertinent for the recipient of a therapy or a procedure, in withdrawal of information that is very pertinent for their agreement to receive or not to receive a particular treatment or therapeutic regimen given to them. In absence of the consent forms, there is a very big, there's room for so much ignorance and misinformation that comes in. And now that is my biggest challenge as a medical person who works with outpatients in community pharmacies. If somebody does come and approach me and say, can you tell me about the vaccine? I will go through, probably I'll tell them, okay, so this is what the benefits, we've been told the benefits are, and these were the risks. This is what is happening in real time, or what they call real world studies. And then I take them to the CDC website. As you know, the CDC has said, even with the Senate, that they should. We drill them through all of these. And most times the questions are, okay, so how prevalent are these side effects? And we have to give them raw data and say, okay, so this is what's happening, this is where people have benefited, and this is where people have not benefited. And we have to, we give them what we, as a comprehensive CV, for lack of a better word to put it, of the vaccine, to the knowledge that we have, both from the CDC and also from scientific studies and demographics that are emerging. And then we leave them to exercise their volition, whether to consent to that or not. But that has come with a lot of challenges, because the interface of people that I have on a daily or weekly basis in a community pharmacy is limited. The numbers are limited. How about the people who do not have smartphones upcountry? Well, yes, this is a technology age. We encourage people to get educated and have the full CV of the vaccine. And if they have more questions, they can approach us. That's true. But how about when they get to the site where they're going to administer this? Do the people know what they're receiving? Does somebody know, for example, if they have, let's say, a medical condition such as deep vein thrombosis, which is a clotting disorder, or somebody who has deep vein thrombosis, DVT, or varicose veins, that they have an increased propensity to blood clots and thrombotic adverse events that have actually been recorded in real time in nations that have vaccinated a considerable proportion of their populations? Do they know about this? Does somebody, for example, who has an autoimmune condition or who has been on chemotherapy, do they know about how safe this is for them? Are they being told about this? So there is a very big gap that has been created by the withdrawal of consent forms, and the lack of the informed of information that is necessary for consent is something that is not ethical, and we would like to see reversed with regard to the people knowing exactly the pros and cons, and not selectively giving them some information that is biased one way or the other, but giving them a full buffet, for lack of a better word again, of what they are getting, so that they can exercise their right, they can exercise their understanding, they can understand and know when to say no. I don't think that I'm a candidate for this. Or even for medical practitioners to come out and say, look, for example, you have had a brain tumor, you have been on chemo, you have not actually gotten, for example, a yellow fever vaccine. I actually know somebody who has been in such a situation, and if they've not been able to get something that is recommended for travel across borders and at customs and immigrations, when they have to cross the border into other nations, they're actually given an exemption, and they say, where's your yellow fever card? And they're like, no, I've been on chemo for this, and they're allowed to pass. If someone is so sensitive to other vaccines, then surely the question is, are they eligible for a technology that is new, for a group of vaccines that is new? Will they consent to it? Do they know about this? There's a very big gap with regard to correct informed consent, which is a tenet of biomedical ethics that has been created by the withdrawal of the consent forms.
Megan, I just have a question to you. One of the things that Doreen mentioned that's currently happening in Uganda due to closure of schools over an extended period of time is that I think over 50% of the teachers have opted to go and get into some other kind of business, or venture into some other money-making business, so to say, or opportunity. We've obviously had quite a big number of school dropouts, increased teenage pregnancies, increased substance abuse, and child abuse. My question to you is, do you have a comparative experience where you are, and how can we address the case that's going on? How can we make the wrong right going forward, following what we've observed over the past over 1.5 years, especially regarding schools and the treatment that has been given to it? The difference with our nation, Uganda, and it's publicly known that its schools have been closed for the longest period of time. That might not be the same for you, but have you had any effects due to school closure, and how do we rectify that going forward?
I think it's a good time to focus on what you would do differently in your school systems and address those issues while they're closed. I think that there has been a long time to address any pre-existing issues and make progress in those areas. And I know that that's a little bit, Bobby, don't do that. Sorry, my little guy is up and helping me, and he's 2, and sorry, so you might hear him in the background. But I think it's a really important thing to say. We are experiencing the same detrimental effects here, but instead of sending everybody back with this blanket false measure that doesn't actually remediate the issue, you can overcome a year of learning gains. You can, but the developmental detriment and the psychological detriment that can it can be lasting. You're effectively teaching children to fear touch and proximity and see others as grody, germy others, and I think that there's a real issue with that. One of the things that I had wanted to touch on that I've also seen Dr. Mark Changizi touch on previously is he's done a lot with visual field interferences, and it's also a public safety concern to me that we have so many in our country. We have a lot of masked bus drivers, we have masked public transit drivers, and you have a lot of people you're responsible for when you're putting an apparatus that decreases oxygen on someone, in addition to interfering with their visual field while driving. I don't think that schools should remain closed, but I do, as I discuss in the Goldilocks article that I posted above, I do think that we should ask the teachers and we should ask the students and their families if they feel in need of additional accommodations, because I think that most people really just prefer to go back completely to normal. But you're never going to know exact numbers till you ask everybody. So I have surveys for parents and surveys for teachers and staff that are part of that article that can be used, so you can get a better understanding of how comfortable people in a specific community are. And it's very easy to staff out a structured reopening based on using those surveys. And I think that what it boils down to is you have people butting heads here. You have people who really want a given measure and they want it implemented for everyone they come into contact with. And then you have people who are like, no, this isn't working, I'm done with that. And both of those voices are valid, because there are people who are truly vulnerable out there, but playing make-believe and playing pretend isn't gonna get us there any sooner. And so I think reopening everything in a structured manner that focuses both on the behavior of the pathogen in a given environment and it gives a meaningful voice to those who are saying like, hey, I have legitimate concerns here. But going and putting everybody back, our district that I'm in had everybody go back under a mask mandate, and our case rates were far higher than in districts where there was no mandate. And I think that it changes people's behavior. I think that it changes how much caution people are taking for the protection of themselves and others, and I don't think it's the correct mitigating measure.
Mark Changizi here again. I mean, in terms of the population, children's population has effectively zero risk, and if you relativize that to flu, it's 10 to 15 times lower risk than it ever was for flu. And at this point, most a significant fraction of children have probably already been exposed, have natural immunity, and have even lower risk than their otherwise low risk. And the problem is that none of what I just said is understood by those in the mainstream narrative, who in country after country have astronomically wrong beliefs about the dangers of COVID. And so how does one overcome it? So even last July in European countries and in the United States, the median respondent thought that 9% of the population of the United States had already died of COVID. The actual numbers, of course, were 500 times lower than that. And of course, they were all disproportionately 82 years old and above with multiple comorbidities. In Australia earlier this year, they polled folks and asked them what is the average infection fatality rate, that is the average chance of dying if you get it. And the average respondent in Australia said that the infection fatality rate was 38%. That is, they believed that you had a 38% chance of dying if you got it. Now, even the most comorbidity-filled 83-year-old doesn't have a 38% chance. It might be around 5%, which is sizable, and a couple times higher than an average flu for that age demographic. But the infection fatality rate changes over over 1,000-fold difference between children and those in their 80s, and the average, which of course is an average across all of those demographics, and isn't particularly a great number, but it's around 0.15%, 0.2%. And in countries with young demographics, like in many parts of Africa, it's significantly lower because, of course, it's just not the same huge percentage of the older demographic. These numbers, though, are nowhere near what actual people believe. And so long as people believe the kinds of numbers that they believe, which are 1,000-fold off in all the respects of how dangerous COVID is, and in all the respects in which they believe that masks and the interventions work and the vaccines stop transmission because they're like holy water that they're pouring on you. That's their impression about vaccines. None of what we say matters as long as we're treated as unclean demons who are suggesting these things that are perfectly preventing this terrible virus, right? And that's the problem that one has to overcome. This is not mere disagreements, small disagreements about the data. This is one side who believes radically, astronomically wrong things about the data, and yet believes that we are the misinformants, the disinformers who should be censored from society. None of these conversations that we're having, as rational as they are, when argued straight to them, they often have no impact. Where they have impact potentially is on those who are kind of on our side. They see that there's something wrong, and then you can educate them and give them confidence. But those who are already in the narrative, we've lost them. Once a taboo like this happens, like wearing a mask, being naked, I talk about in some of my videos. Once you've grown up, and naked is what naked, different countries, naked means different things. In Iran, where my family comes from, a woman is naked if her hair is showing at all. Even some hair is coming out of her hijab, that's naked and completely awful, just like walking in without pants into a restaurant, right? But we can't even fathom that because we didn't grow up that way. But you grow up, or you spend a sufficient period of time with masks on your face, and then in the wrong circumstances, and at a restaurant or a certain kind of public places, you don't have a mask on, you feel naked. Once you start to feel that way, and the younger you are, the more it's going to happen. It doesn't go away. And once you feel that the world has cooties is the English word for meaning just like kids will say, oh, I don't want to touch her, she's got cooties, that kind of, it's an infectious thing. These infectious notions of infectiousness sticks with you forever, which is why some cultures will eat crabs and lobsters like we do in America, but other cultures think that they have cooties and they're disgusting, and no one in their right mind would have those because they're just gross. And you're not going to get them to eat crabs. It's too late, just like me and spiders, let's say, even though they're close cousins. These things are going to be difficult to get beyond, and and so what. And I don't have firm answers. I'm working on them. But as you've all realized, if you feel like you're in Alice in Wonderland, in a weird, crazy world, that's because you're in one. And so everything that we do in all of our arguments has to be thought through about how we can come around this. Because I don't think these straightforward. And let me put my video back on. I don't necessarily think that coming at it straightforward as we've been. Here's the arguments, and here's the argument. It hasn't worked in 20 months. If anything, the narrative that we're fighting has gotten more hardened. They've gotten closer. They're more sure than ever that the lockdowns and the masks work. And now that the vaccines work, even though the vaccines still are potentially augmenting spread, and there's even they might provide protective value individually, but even there, I won't get into it. There's a lot of issues about whether they're even personally preventing protective, not to mention dealing with the potential side effects, especially if you're young, as to whether it's a net positive. But none of that's going to matter to them because the vaccine is holy water. It's a membership signal into a club when you get vaccinated. The most important thing that you do when you get vaccinated is not the mere feeling of it's nice that I was vaccinated. No, it's telling people that I've been vaccinated. Here's my vaccination card, signaling on Twitter, I'm vaccinated now, I'm part of the club, look at me, I'm clean now, and I'm not part of. These are real things that go on in real minds, and these are what's driving the pandemic, so to speak, everywhere. So that's my worry, and I feel like people at various stages. Last April of 2020, Alex Berenson is a well-known journalist who got kicked off Twitter, and he's been fighting this. And he said, okay, it's over, folks, because there was some really great argument back in April of 2020 about how the narrative was wrong. And I said, look, no, the narrative's not over. Once these reputations rise of all of these people who said, you know, they're baton twirlers for the pandemic and how dangerous it is, they've risen in reputation, right? That makes they're even more sure that they're right, and their followers are more sure that they're right, because the narrative is saying more and more things that then give, you know, that are just making it up after the fact, but nevertheless they really do believe it, and it's really is science. It's science publications that are backing them up. So here, let me just end with this topic. In Iran, where my family comes from, the arguments for women wearing hijab and 100 other kinds of arbitrary things you have to do to be a good Muslim, but focusing on the hijab. The arguments for women wearing hijab and all of the other constraints on the freedoms of women, yes, they're religious, but they're much more than religious. They come across as almost like Islamic science. There's like books and books of all of these details that like all of the scholars have worked through, and why it's like totally important for society and health and the goodness of humanity that women wear these hijabs. And it's very hard. You can't argue your way out of those. And it's enforced on the street by otherwise perfectly nice lady or guy who doesn't work for the government, but they're going to come attack you if a lock of your curls are showing. Now imagine what we're facing when it's not a religious enforcement on the street, but it's a scientist, and they're claiming to have real data, and they're a doctor, and they've got really good laurels because they went to Oxford or Cambridge, and now they have science, and it really is a pandemic. Whereas in Iran, a woman who's showing her lock might be called infectious because her beliefs and her ideas and her behavior is infectious and can spread badness. Well, here there really is an infection. It's not just a metaphor. This makes all these things much harder than I think it is even in places like Iran or Nazi Germany, or in all of these sorts of cases where the unclean enemy is deemed as a metaphor infectious and believed in people's minds as infectious. But now there really is an infection, and it really is scientists' arguments. And Iran, it's been 40 plus years now, and it's not going away. A lot of these places, it never went away, except by, you know, rivers of blood, so to speak, through war. So the question is, we have to bear in mind, these things go away very slowly, one person at a time. It doesn't mean we should stop arguing the science one by one, because maybe over time, the big nebulous 80% in the middle that we're really understanding, maybe we can win them over. But I don't think we're going to win anybody that's in the hardcore mainstream narrative. Nothing you can do will change their minds.
It's unfortunate that the lockdowners have been indoctrinated and are not willing to listen to anything or to consider any contrary information from, the other group, one that you like to call the skeptics. Now, you spoke of religious enforcement, and I'm going to bring in Honorable Alice Alaso on that very point. For those of us that might not know her, she is a Ghanaian politician and Deputy National Coordinator of ANT, Alliance National Transformation Political Party. She's also the former MP of Serre, and she is a devout, proud Christian. Honorable Alaso, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. And
we're delighted to have you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
First of all, I want to thank the organizers for letting me be a part of this conversation today. I must say that the much I have listened to is very, very helpful, very enriching. And so I'm glad to be here this afternoon. Thank you.
All right. The topic at hand, Honorable Alaso, as you might know, is ending lockdown tyranny. Lessons, reflections, choices beyond COVID-19 mandates. Now, you have been, or you were one of the parties that dragged the state to the Constitutional Court over the extended closure of places of worship since 2020. Over the past couple of months following that suit, places of worship have been partially reopened to a maximum of 200, but with other conditions. Now, my question to you is, what is your take on the continued closure of places of worship, especially because following the address by the president, I think on the 28th of October, where he mentioned that or emphasized that the state or the economy would fully reopen in January next year, the key being vaccination of over 12 million people. As a Christian or as one that is very interested in religious matters, do you think that the full reopening of the economy, and obviously including places of worship, should be pegged on vaccination? Do we have to wait for January for us to, think about resuming, worship, or, kind of pushing for that? Or is it something that should have happened yesterday?
So that's a very interesting question. Now let me begin from the point of us having gone to the Constitutional Court to seek an interpretation of the guidelines and the subsequent clampdown on places of worship. What to us that meant was simply discrimination and infringement on our rights to freely associate and to freely worship. And our argument was then and up to now is that if other areas are not suffering the same limitations, then why would the limitation be imposed on a place of worship? So yes, you rightly say that they have opened up to a maximum of 200 people. But as you know that Christianity or religious freedom is also about getting our children to understand, practice, or exercise our religious beliefs. And therefore, as long as our children do not have the freedom to go to Sunday school, we have a lot of issues pending. Secondly, those guidelines, the standard operating guidelines of the Ministry of Health of Uganda, continue to be in force. It's just a matter of time. If the president wakes up today and says lockdown, churches don't open, at his word, those guidelines will be brought to apply. So our interest is to pursue this matter to a logical conclusion to the extent that we get an interpretation of what these guidelines really mean to our constitutional freedoms and our freedoms to freely worship God the way we choose. Uganda is a country which is almost 98% religious. We worship God one way or the other in this country. And therefore, that is a very, very big matter here. So we don't feel that the lift up right now is adequate. We need that totally lifted and that freedom granted to us. But then you also know that elsewhere in the country, now the issue has to do with the vaccination, which is almost turning out commonly. I think I had panelists speak about mandate, So I have already heard that in some universities here, Chambogo, you cannot access the lecture halls if you're not, you can't even access the compound if you're not vaccinated or something like that. And my fear is that is going to come into the church or the worship arena as well. That if you're not vaccinated, then you are not going to be allowed either to pastor or to preach or to go and associate with others. Now, what does that mean to us? One, the rate at which the government of Uganda is procuring the vaccines is, to everybody's guess, really would help to procure vaccines for those who need to. I still strongly believe that vaccination should be by choice. I still think so. I don't know any law in this country that requires that people should be forced mandatorily vaccinated. And so that by implication, if it happens, if there are some individuals who will not want, for whatever health reason or religious beliefs, or even not want to get at this particular time, but are hoping to get it later. If those type of individuals are there, then their rights to worship, to congregate with others, and their rights to even go to school will be curtailed and are being curtailed. And I think that is not fair. I was in my village yesterday, and I found that the whole village was rounded up, literally forcefully. And people were being told, you must go get vaccinated. We know this home if you're not getting vaccinated. And so I found my sister who was suffering from high blood pressure. She's hypertensive, and she was really scared and nervous. And I told her, why don't you explain this to the medical officers? See, they are not even there. It is now the LCs. So it's terrifying. But then the other bit of this lifting of the lockdown, ordinarily lockdown should serve the purpose of allowing us to prepare more, allowing us to study the situation, as has been already said. But then the terrifying bit about the proposal of January is that, first of all, anyhow, we didn't draw any lessons. This country went into a lockdown and came out of it without preparing the health system. So the assumption now is the vaccine is it's the magic wand. It will do everything. And God forbid that if we end up in a situation where we even have another outbreak of any other thing, we will probably now have to use lockdowns as the means of managing our health service delivery in Uganda. That's part of the problem. It's disturbing. The second bit of what is disturbing is that there is no plan. I had expected when the president did the last address for him to have said to the nation that our plan is that on the 5th of January, all schools will reopen. On the 10th, churches will fully reopen. On the 20th, something like that. But he didn't. Up to now, government is playing its cards very close to its chest. There are no timelines and nobody can measure progress. So it is between the Ministry of Health and the presidency for them to say, okay, now we have vaccinated 2 million or 10 million or nobody at all, and therefore we will not fully reopen. So that's not helpful, because we as stakeholders, we are participants. It is wrong for the president and his team that are at the helm of the management of the COVID pandemic in this country to assume that we are passive participants. We are very key stakeholders as ordinary Ugandans aching a living out there and having children who should go to school, or as pastors who need to know when the rest of the people will be able to come back to church as a full congregation. We need to know the timelines. We need to begin to plan. We need to, see what adjustments that we can make. So if you ask me, what did we learn? What did we benefit? We benefited from a season of restraint, kept the people in, and then unfortunately, we misused the time, the breather that the lockdowns gave us. We up to now are asking government to account for the resources that were mobilized from people internationally, locally, World Bank and whatever. Nobody's seeing accountability, and that is actually responsible. So in this country, one way or the other, COVID became a tool for oppression, politically, religiously, and economically. And I think that is not good. So we therefore now have some questions. I like to ask the scientists, my fellow colleagues. There's still just one question lingering in my head. I hear, for instance, that in Europe, there are certain vaccines, like in Germany, there are certain vaccines that you will not give certain age groups. And I'm thinking in Uganda, every vaccine goes for everybody, apart from the children. When I went to my village, I was asking them, so what are you getting here? Some are getting AstraZeneca, some are getting Sinovac, some are getting Pfizer. Everybody is getting anything. And then a friend of mine in Germany tells me her doctor said those within the reproductive age should not get this particular vaccine. Scientists in the panel, please help me. What guidance can we get? But I want to thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to make this brief input.
Thank you very much, Honorable Alice Alaso. If time allows, we'll have a scientist respond to your question. Right now, I just want to bring in Simon Senyonga. He is a lawyer. And I want to ask Simon a question, very direct. Have churches or places of worship had any significant role that they've played in countries that, chose to leave them in operation? You've been one of the proponents that has, been pushing for the immediate reopening of places of worship. Is there justification for your demand?
Thank you very much. Definitely, yes, there is. And churches, yes, have played a very key role, especially in the social, political, and economic development of the different nations. And I think that cuts across the various nations. The purpose of the places of worship is not just to gather the faithful for the sake of, enriching them with the word of God in whatever religion that they fall in. But when you look at, for example, the history of Uganda, the political, social, and economic strata has been firmly grounded by the places of worship. They have contributed not only to the organization. You see, Mark and Megan could relate to the various epidemics which have happened in the USA. I think there was, I heard of the Singapore flu. There was then the Ebola epidemic during Barack Obama's time. In Uganda, in the early 80s, we had the surge of the HIV and AIDS. The president of Uganda then, who is still the president of Uganda now, made a serious drive to mobilize the population to guard themselves against the HIV and AIDS epidemic in Uganda. And the key partners that had to be used were the places of worship. In the COVID-19, a strategic plan was adopted by the Ugandan government, which had to have a community engagement perspective. And they had to use the places of worship to extend that message, all right? Now, it's also interesting that you realize that in the preconditions that were given the places of worship in Uganda to open, one of those was to popularize the government program on the vaccination uptake in Uganda. So, in Uganda, we have a history of the places of worship and churches specifically being a social mobilization tool, even economically, because I was looking through one of the tweets of one of the cultural leaders in Uganda, and it was a cartoon that was drawn of him mobilizing. I can be specific here. This was the Katikiro of Buganda, the Prime Minister of the Buganda Kingdom, which is the biggest ethnic group within Uganda. And this cartoon had him and the Minister of Health. And on one side, the Minister of Health, they put a drawing against her and they said she had power, but the Katikiro had trust. So traditional places carry the same weight as the places of worship, because traditional places also have an element of traditional worship to them. Now, what that communicates is that places of worship hold the highest esteem of trust amongst the citizens, which politicians may not have. So in terms of the economic drive, the places of worship hold the trust, the politicians have the power. But you see, and that is speaking in terms of the state armory and all that, but in terms of the stronger voice, the places of worship do have actually a stronger voice. So yes, the places of worship play a very key role in actually dealing with the development of nations. I'll finalize with this particular point. When you look at the statistics of Uganda and how it has suffered because of the blanket lockdown measures, one of the key areas which has struggled is the business area. And in this business area, I want you to take specific interest in what they call the faith-based tourism. What faith-based tourism means is that Uganda is a place of, it's a center of attraction either in terms of religious sites or traditional sites, which attracts many people all over the world to come and visit. People will travel from America to come and visit the Kasubi tombs in Kasubi. They will travel from Europe to just come and visit the Martyrs Shrine in Uganda. The Pope has traveled all the way from Rome to come and pay allegiance and homage to the Namugongo Shrine. Now, when you partially open up places of worship, what you do is that you're denying an opportunity to those who would have brought in resources from the faith-based tourism to come and enhance the economy of Uganda. And mind you, tourism is one of the biggest avenues of resource collection in Uganda. Now, there is no way you cannot fail to think about faith-based tourism as a key driving element towards the exponential growth of the economy of Uganda. And so definitely, yes, the places of worship play a major role in the development of any nation.
Oh, thank you, Simon. Okay, so beyond faith-based tourism, do places of worship have any additional role to play in this nation, particularly Uganda, or worldwide post-lockdowns?
I think all over the world, I think there's one thing that we get into agreement with. Recently, I was watching a video by Mark Chansley. I think you have a video on your page which talks about how you came to respect religion. Now, one of the things I came to learn in hindsight from that video was that religion and places of worship hold the place of the national consciousness of the nation. They are the key persuasive factor to the nationals to be driven towards a particular course of action. The biggest inspiration for any nation to pursue a particular path will normally and predominantly come from the stand that the leaders of the places of worship take. I was reading, before I came on here, I was reading a case in the Americas, I think, concerning the occupational safety and health, something actually recently which was challenged by the likes of Candace Owens and that other group. And one of the key proponents in that case were the places of worship. I had Mark referring to the delusion that comes to the minds of men because of the occulty. Now, all that gets to draw you to one factor, that humanity from all the ends of the world is in pursuit of a particular fulfillment, which may not be accomplished by the politicians or the economists. But somehow they're seeking for that fulfillment, peradventure in the wrong places, but the places of worship are key places, not only in terms of, as I said, spiritual nourishment, but also as centers of rehabilitation. Where COVID-19 has, acted pathetically on the mental health of many citizens, the places of worship are a bigger alternative. And in Uganda, it becomes very relevant because, according to the last population census of 2002 that we had, at least according to the statistics of Uganda Bureau of Standards, 95% of the Ugandan population are believers, or so to say, they are aligned to a particular religion. Majority are Christians, Catholic, Anglicans, you have the Pentecostals, you have the Islam. Now, what that speaks to is that religion and places of worship where this religion is practiced and manifest play a very key role in actually guiding the consciousness of the people, guiding the consciousness of nations. And in Africa generally, where we have been, where there is a deep belief in traditional culture and religion, you realize that this is a very key element that you cannot take out when you're having to push the social mobilization of the citizens to participate in a particular aspect. Now, what happens in Uganda right now, or in different places I've seen across the world, is that because they know that places of worship will deal a major blow to frustrate any wrong ideas that are propagated by Fauci or CDC or the different ministers of health or the different governmental bodies like, and other intergovernmental bodies or international bodies like World Health Organization or United Nations, what they will do is that they will curtail the freedom of worship. They will declare it non-essential, and with doing that, what they will say is that you can follow the economy. So the whole mantra which is being quite that follow the science, in terms of reverse psychology, is telling you that don't follow anything else but science, or discredit any other dominant belief but science. So the discrediting of a fundamental element of belief amongst the Africans or around the world, what that would get to show you that this place is actually a strong center of power.
All right, thank you, Simon. If you're interested in more of Mark Chengizi's content, you can visit his YouTube channel, Mark Chengizi, and look at the different videos that have been displayed. As we prepare to wind up, I am going to allow for the scientists to respond to Honorable Alaso, just so she can put her mind to rest. You had her question about the select administration of vaccines to different groups, so to say. Dr. Eva, we're going to put you on the spot for this. Honorable Alaso says she's not had scientists explain to Ugandans these different vaccines and administration, so to say. What do you have to say about that?
Thank you for that question, Honorable Alaso and Evelyn. I would say that generally speaking, in Uganda, the vaccination exercise is still relatively new. And well, compared to our Western world, Northern Hemisphere counterparts, because ours started really, I think we got our second batch this year, and it's still quite new. Well, generally speaking, the technology that was used to develop the COVID-19 vaccines globally is also a new phenomenon. We have been used to different types of vaccines other than this particular technology, and there's still a lot that globally there's a lot of questions people are studying. There's emerging scientific studies and demographics that are coming out. The scientific community is really abuzz with questions similar to yours, and more so in Uganda. The way that the Ugandan healthcare system is structured is mainly, it's tiered, yes, but it's mainly, the communication mainly comes from the top downwards, and there isn't so much communication from the bottom upwards as it should be. So that is why many people like yourself, Honorable Alaso, and probably our viewers and listeners are not getting much of this information, save from their own reading, right? So just like I think one of our panelists mentioned that, actually it was you who said that in her village, there were LCs and non-medical people who were rallying people for vaccination. I don't know about the administration. It should be that vaccines are administered by trained personnel, medical personnel, not security personnel, not, anything else, but someone should have medical training for that, at least maybe a bare minimum being Red Cross or Red Crescent or something like that. In absence of that, yes, there is going to be lack of information being given to people, and where there is a specific narrative that is being pushed behind selective information, like tweaking it, trimming it, and maybe talking about one or the other, it poses great challenges. But as a pharmacist, I would say that excuse me, generally speaking, the novel COVID-19 vaccines, my interest as a pharmacist is mainly from the mechanism of action. So from what I do recall from an interview done by Dr. Diana Twine, I think that's the permanent secretary for the Ministry of Health, she talked about how in Uganda, we are mainly using Pfizer and AstraZeneca. And she mentioned that Uganda actually there were plans for Uganda to develop their own COVID-19 vaccine, yes, and that we would adopt a model called the Adenov virus vector vaccine model. So of these two that we're using in Uganda mainly, the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca, their mechanisms of action are a little bit different, and I won't make it too complex to understand, but basically one uses a virus carrier to carry the genetic information to help your body produce the spike protein. The other one is is an artificially produced sphere, a globe in which the mRNA messenger RNA is used to carry the information for production of the spike protein by your body. There is that artificial vehicle, a lipid nanosphere that is used to get the body to do that. So that is the main difference between them, and each of these has its different challenges, challenges and pluses and minuses. Like I said earlier, with the artificially created sphere, I'm going to use that word to make it easy to understand, but with the artificially created sphere, there's certain excipients, certain additives that are put into the formula besides the active pharmaceutical, what we call an API, active pharmaceutical ingredient, in this case in the vaccine, that are supposed to make the sphere stable and make it exact in its delivery of the RNA into the cells to elicit the effect of, teaching your body how to create antibodies through spike protein production and all of that. But most of these other additives, it's been scientifically documented, even on the CDC website, that's the Center for Diseases Control, that there may be an allergy to some of the excipients added, all right? So there have been people who have got acute, severe, some mainly even immediate reactions to, for example, polyethylene glycol, PEG, which is one of the additives that even if you go to the safety profile of active biologics on the CDC website, it's one of those that is mentioned. And that is not exactly, that may not be the case with, let's say, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson and many other Sputnik, Sinovac, and other types of vaccines that are out there. So as a pharmacist, my advice probably would be to understand how they work, and caution to be exercised in, one, people who have existing medical conditions. Okay, you mentioned hypertension. That is already an indicator of blood, some blood clotting indices or blood indices. There's conditions.
Eva, I'll request you to conclude, please.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so it has to be based not so much on what one doctor says or another doctor says, but it has to be more about, do you have conditions? Are you pregnant? Have you had difficulties, etc.? That when paired with the way that this vaccine works, okay, and the track record, that a conclusion is drawn about whether you should receive one over the other. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Eva. I wish we had more time to go on and on. Our time is fast spent. I am going to request our panelists to each give their closing remarks in under a minute. I will start with Simon, and then go to Dr. Eva, then go to Mark, go to Megan. I'm not sure if Honorable Alaso is still in line, but if she is, she'll conclude last.
Well, I think the most important thing for us, the lesson we check from here, is that beyond the lockdowns is for us to reflect on the fact that humanity deserves ultimate freedom. Humanity deserves an opportunity to make informed decisions, avail all the full information, especially from the scientists. For me, as a practicing Christian, the biggest thing is to know that the places of worship are extremely essential. If I've learned anything individually in all this work of the COVID-19 quote-unquote period, is that the places of worship are the most fundamental areas that will have to restore hope, restore right perspective and direction, and to be the center of the national consciousness of the nations. So in Uganda and all over the world, we need to have genuine discussion, genuine debate that causes us to think outside that which government bodies are presenting to us, out of which politicians are presenting to us, and let us not toe only that one line or follow the science, follow one narrative, but seek for more wisdom and perspective in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Over to you, Eva.
Yeah, the take home for me would be that we need to understand that mandatory vaccinations is not, like my colleagues have said, a holy water. It's not a silver bullet. There has to be a more holistic perspective to management of COVID-19 besides just the vaccination. Informed consent is a very, very important aspect. And I would recommend that everybody gets to know the pros and cons, the full CV of the vaccines, and if there's information required, you can get that from your healthcare provider, you can get them from your physician, from your pharmacist. Please let us not go into this with a lot of trust. Let us trust our own reading, and let's be good students to know that what we're getting into is either for us or against us. And lastly, there is room for medical exemptions, especially for children. It's included in the Immunization Act based on firm medical grounds where someone is not eligible to get a specific vaccine or therapeutic regimen, especially with regard to minors under 18.
Thank you, Eva. Dr. Mark?
Yeah, I wanted to, sometimes what doesn't matter shows you what matters, and in the context of which vaccine is the best one, you notice how it doesn't matter. Just get jabbed. There's some vaccines have significantly less efficacy than the others, but just get jabbed. Just wear a mask. It doesn't matter whether it's a porous sweater-like material or an N95, it doesn't matter how loosely fit it is, just wear a mask. The fact that when you see what doesn't matter, it helps clearly point to what really matters. And in these cases, what's driving these effects, these policies, these mandates, is not epidemiology, it's not health, it's a need to see that people are obeying and are becoming part of the club and showing conformance. That's why it doesn't matter. By getting the jab, by wearing a mask of any kind, no matter how ineffective, you're showing membership in the club. And that's unfortunately where we are in the kind of battle that we're in. It's really a psychological battle, not an epidemiological.
Thank you, Mark. Megan?
Hi, I have a visitor now. My little guy woke up, and so he's sitting on me now. So he might talk as well. I wanted to touch on something that I didn't hear anybody else speak on, and that's the legitimacy of religious exemptions for the vaccines containing parts of aborted fetal cells, and that's something that I've seen a lot of people practice religious exemptions within the United States and have them accepted based on the content of that matter within the vaccinations. And so I just think it's important that we really take our time and take a step back, because this is what allows us to become better prepared for next time. There will be other pathogens, and if you don't want to see everybody just running around like chickens with their heads cut off and just have a better plan in place that's actually effective and actually mitigating and doesn't shut the whole world down. We start that out in minimum viable particle size under pressure. That's the really important component, is taking a step back and looking at this as a particle. And if that were the case, I don't think that people ever would have gotten on board with the whole any mask will do concept, because it would have allowed us to clearly see it as the behavior. We had this 6 foot under or 6 foot over concept that everybody was on board with when they thought that this was droplet mitigation. And droplet mitigation, things like, hold on, I'm talking right now. In droplet mitigation, things like surface sanitization and hand washing, things like that are important, but the droplet mitigation is far different than aerosol and learning. I just think it's important to be incredibly specific. Thank you.
I just want to thank all the panelists. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you for your opinion. Thank you for sharing your studies, all the information that you have equipped the viewers. I also want to thank our viewers. Thank you for taking the time. We appreciate your comments. We appreciate your engagement. And I'm Evelyn Naikova. Have a great evening.